We have an amazing AV team. So I'm gonna read a bio. What did I just say? Not even 10 minutes ago. Not a huge fan, but doing it anyway. So Susan Cain is an American writer and lecturer. She is the author of the 2012 nonfiction book, Quiet: The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking, which argues that modern Western culture misunderstands and undervalues the traits and capabilities of introverted people. She also co-founded Quiet Revolution. She wrote another book, Quiet Power: The Secret Strengths of Introverts. And a couple of the things that I did ask Susan was, I told you, what is she most excited about? Oh my gosh, it's here. Sorry. Give me just a second. Now I'm going to read it because that's what I'm going to do. Susan Cain believes that society dramatically undervalues the talents of introverts and the creative possibilities that ensue when introverts and extroverts truly respect and understand each other. In her best-selling books, Quiet: The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking, and Quiet Power: The Secret Strengths of Introverts, Susan explores ways for schools and companies to harness the talents of introverts whose input no organization can afford to waste. Susan's TED Talk has been viewed over 19 million times and was named by Bill Gates one of his all-time favorite talks. Her favorite activities: reading, writing, lounging around cafes, and traveling the world with her family. Lately, she's also been on a bit of a tennis kick. A few times a year, she likes to try cooking. I agree with that, Susan. That's good. Try to like it. She uses a lot of old-fashioned expressions, and she is insatiably curious about human nature. My friends, please welcome Susan Cain. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Oh, absolutely.
So first of all, oh gosh, can you all hear me? Yeah? It doesn't sound that loud to me. Is there a way to make my mic a little bit louder? And if not, maybe I can use a handheld. Can you hear me in the back now? Okay. If you can't hear me, raise your hand. Okay, good. So first of all, I just want to say thank you to Amy for amazing grace under pressure. Thank you. And it's so great for me to be here with all of you. I was so excited when Amy invited me to speak at this event because I feel like you all are the people who make our world beautiful. So thank you for doing what you do. And also because I know that as creatives, as designers, depending on what your temperament is like, you probably have very different ways of how you go about achieving that beauty, right? And so for some of you, the pathway to beauty is probably a quite solo and interior one, at least if you have your way, where you're spending quite a bit of time inside your minds. And for some of you, the ideal pathway to beauty is perhaps a more kind of out there, extroverted, exchanging ideas, fast and furious, fast-paced type of process. And it's really, really important for us to understand these two pathways and for the people who want pathway A versus pathway B to understand each other. And so that's what we're here to talk about. And I will tell you that when I first started researching my book, Quiet, I kind of gave myself my own personal tutorial on personality psychology. And I quickly found that personality psychologists agree with each other on practically nothing, except for the one idea that this dimension of temperament, introversion and extroversion, matters. It's the most fundamental aspect of human nature, and that this is true across cultures. And it shapes the way we work, it shapes the way we live, it shapes the way we love. So we really got to understand it. Okay, so people often ask me how it is that I came to be so passionate about this topic in the first place. And I bet all of you really relate to this. If you're someone who's passionate about what you're doing as an adult, chances are the seeds of that passion were right there from the time that you were a child. And that's how it was with me. And so I want to just tell you a story from my childhood that I think will give you a sense of how I came to be doing what I do. This is a story from the time that I was 9 years old. And I went off to summer camp for the first time, out in the woods for 8 weeks, cabin in the woods. And my mother packed for me a suitcase full of books, which in our family was a very natural thing to do if you were going off to the woods for the summer. I came from this very quiet and scholarly family. And I had a vision that I was going to get to camp and be surrounded by my new friends, and we would be cozily reading books together in our matching pajamas. And I got to camp on the very first day and was confronted with a very different prospect, which was a very cheerful camp counselor, who was probably a college student, I realize now. And she said that she was going to be teaching us a cheer, which we would then be performing for the rest of the summer. And the cheer went like this. It went, R-O-W-D-I-E, that's the way we spell rowdy, rowdy, rowdy. Let's get rowdy. I couldn't figure out for the life of me, why did we have to be so rowdy? And why did we have to spell this word incorrectly? But, you know, I kept on doing the cheer for the rest of the summer, and I did my best approximation of a rowdy and gregarious camper. And I kind of started to enjoy doing the cheer. But I did that throughout the rest of my childhood, too. You know, I was always trying to act more extroverted than I really was. And I did it into my young adulthood, too, so that even though I had wanted to be a writer since the time I was 4 years old, I actually went off and became a Wall Street lawyer until my early 30s. And there were a bunch of reasons for this, but one of them was that I was in such a habit of trying to prove to myself that I could be this kind of out there, take charge person that the world tells you you were supposed to be. And I came to believe that this was a huge mistake, and that, yes, for sure, all of us sometimes need to step outside of our character, go outside our comfort zone for the sake of our work and for the sake of people we love, for sure. But it's a mistake to try to turn yourself inside out and to be somebody who you're not. And I realized that this is a mistake that we're making, that not only I was making, but that we're making in our schools, we're making it in our workplaces, we're making it in society as a whole. And it's actually a mistake that's quite easy to fix once you become aware of it. So that's the good news about this. And so let me tell you 3 different things we're going to talk about. One of them is that introverts make up 1/3 to 1/2 of the population. So that's 1 out of every 2 or 3 people you know. And we're going to talk about just how to rethink this personality trait that affects so many people, whether it's you sitting here right now, or your colleagues, or your loved ones. Okay, and then second, without having had a chance to chat with many of you yet, I know this about you. I know that you are all attending way too many meetings. And I know that this is interfering with your ability to be as creative as you would like to be. And so we're going to talk about why it is that solitude matters in the creative process and how to rescue it. Okay, and then number 3, I want to talk about leadership and about the kind of ideas that we have about who makes a good leader and who doesn't, and ways to really open up that kind of thinking. Okay, so those 3 things we're doing today. But first, I want to get each of you thinking about who you are and really where do you fall on this introvert-extrovert spectrum. And in my book, Quiet, I've got this personality test that I developed based on years of research. But we don't have time today to go into that test. And so we're going to get at this in a more unorthodox way. So I just shared with you a story from my childhood that I think tells you a lot about who I really am. I'm going to ask you now briefly to break into groups of 4 and to share with your group a story that tells us who you really are. And then I'm going to ask each group to select the most poignant and private of these stories and share them with the room as a whole. And from this collaborative group process, a larger truth will emerge. And I'm just kidding. I am just kidding you all. We are not going to do any such thing. We will not be doing this. But, yeah. I know, I know. I know, so for those of you who are clearly like, how can I get out of here right now? And I saw the looks on your faces. I apologize to all of you for those moments. But hopefully it made the point that we introverts are forever obliged to be participating in these kinds of exercises, the utility of which often eludes us. And this is not to say that introverts don't like collaborating. We do. This has been proven from management research. But it is to say that we like the kind of collaboration where everybody gets to go off and work deeply on their own piece of the puzzle, and then you have some mechanics or some method for sharing what it is you've come up with, what it is you've learned. Okay, but I do want each of you really to think about this, and I promise for the rest of our time, no more trick questions. So I'm just going to ask you quietly in your seats to imagine that you have been at a party, and imagine it's a fun party, you're enjoying yourself, you love the company around you. If you are an extrovert, and I'm sure many of you will have heard this before, if you're an extrovert, it's as if you have an internal battery that is getting charged by this social experience. And so by the end of 2 hours at this fun party, you're looking for more because you're full of energy now. And if you're an introvert, it doesn't matter how socially skilled you are, it doesn't matter how much fun you've been having at the party, at the end of the 2 or 3 hours, your battery is draining. And so you're starting to wish you were home in your pajamas. And for many of us, this feeling kind of comes over us instantly. It's like you hit a wall. And this idea of the battery inside us, it's a great metaphor. It's a great shorthand, it's a great metaphor. But I do want you to understand that it is only a metaphor for what's happening neurobiologically. Because the thing is that we have different nervous systems. We are wired differently. And so extroverts well, let me start with introverts, actually. Introverts are wired in such a way that we react more to stimulation. And this means that we feel at our most alive and our most switched on when things are a little mellower around us, because there aren't so many stimuli bombarding us in those moments. And for extroverts, your nervous systems react less to stimulation. So you have the opposite set of strengths and liabilities, because for you, you're going to be feeling at your best when there's a lot going on, because that's your sweet spot. Your nervous system is built for all those stimuli. But for you, the liability is when there's not enough happening, when things get too quiet. If you're working in a super quiet office space, for example, you might start to find that you are feeling kind of listless and sluggish and not energetic and not at your top productivity. And this stuff really makes a difference. It's been documented in babies as young as 4 days old. So researchers have given babies sugar water to suck on. And sugar water is a form of stimulation, just the way going to a party would be. And what you find is that the babies who salivate more in response to the sugar water, which shows us that they have a more reactive nervous system, those babies, scientists have followed them through their lives, they're more likely to grow up introverted. They're more likely to react more always to the stimulation around them. When they're 2 years old, you put them in a play group of kids they've never seen before, and those are the babies who are going to tend to kind of react like this and not want to join in right away, because their nervous systems are telling them there's like a lot of inputs here and we need to kind of pause and check it out. Now, we tend to think about these personality differences as being only about how do we show up socially, but their effects are much broader than that. So, for example, there was a famous study where a psychologist gave math problems to introverts and extroverts to do with varying levels of background noise playing, and he found that the extroverts did well when the background noise was loud, and the introverts did much better when the background noise was softer. And I think that is a profound bit of research for all of you who are out there thinking about how can I and my colleagues be in our most creative, because it's telling us that there's no such thing as a one-size-fits-all setup. You can't do that. You've got to have office environments and beyond where people can kind of tailor the amount of stimulation that's coming at them at any given time. And I also want to ask each of you to start paying attention to this in yourselves, because no matter where you tend to fall, introvert, extrovert, your craving for stimulation is going to vary throughout the day. And if you become more aware of it, you can kind of toggle your workday so that you're in your sweet spot as much as you can be. So when you're starting to feel that sluggish feeling, that's when you go and chat with your colleagues. And when you're starting to feel the overwhelmed feeling, that's when you go and you take a solitary walk around the block. And in this way, just think of the 2 words, sweet spot. Like, how can I be in my sweet spot as much as possible? Okay, now, having said all this so far, I'm just going to take a quick show of hands. How many of you would describe yourselves as introverts? Okay, that's an awful lot of you. And how many extroverts? Okay, so I'm going to say for you guys it was something like 70-30. There were, I think, some of you not raising your hands, and this might be because you're ambiverts and you weren't sure where you fall. That's a term that psychologists have coined to describe people who tend to be in the middle of the spectrum, and that's a phenomenon too. And I often think that ambiverts have the best of both worlds, so, so that's good for you. Okay, I want you guys to look at this picture. It's a photograph of a music class for toddlers. And if you look at it from just kind of a hazy distance point of view, that's what you see. But if you look at it more closely, you will see the fundamentals of social dynamics, because you will see that some of the kids are clinging kind of closely to the sides of their caregivers, and then you've got others, like that little guy who's in the red jumpsuit in the center of the circle, who has no idea where his mom is. and it's totally okay with him. He, chances are, was born a more bold and exploratory type of child. The narrative that's often playing in the minds of the caregivers of the more quiet and cautious children is often a narrative of concern that says, my child seems to be getting less out of this experience than some of the other kids in the room. And oh my gosh, is this going to be the story of this child's life? Will they always be getting less out of all their experiences? And so what I want to say to those of you who might be caregivers of such children, or even more likely grown-up versions of such children yourselves, or colleagues of grown-up versions of these children, is that there's a lot more going on here than meets the eye, because the kids who are sitting there so quietly are not sitting there inertly. And I feel like creative people really understand this. There's this feeling of, you might be behind a quiet and impassive mask of a face, but there's a lot going on inside there. And those children are taking in the subtleties of the world around them. It's going to take them longer often to join in, but when they do, they often have a very deep understanding of what that social experience is that they're joining. And this style of taking in subtleties will stay with these children as they grow. So when they're a little bit older, if you give them this kind of a puzzle to solve, where the job is to discern the subtle differences between 2 pictures that appear to be alike, you will find that the quiet and cautious children do better on a puzzle like this than the bolder children do. In the lab, you literally can see their eyes moving back and forth more frequently, comparing the 2 pictures than the eyes of the bolder children. These are just, there's no intelligence difference whatsoever, there's no IQ difference. It's just in this type of a task, there is a way of taking in information where one style is primed to kind of see the subtleties and think about, what about this? What if this went wrong? What about this potentiality? And then another style is more likely to be like, just do it, seize the day. There's an almost perfect synchronicity between the wiring of extroverts and our cultural imperative to seize the day. And when you start looking at it this way, you start to see how desperately we need both types of people, because you can't really function without these 2 modes of being. The one that kind of goes a little more slowly and is taking in subtlety here, subtlety there, and the one that's like, yes, joyfully going forward. Okay. When you start looking around you, you will see that many successful organizations are based on this idea of yin and yang, of really needing both types. And so this is one of my favorite examples. How many of you recognize these two guys? Yeah, a lot of you. So this is a very young Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs. I think this is a photograph of them when they had done the first Apple computer prototype. Steve Wozniak, people think of Steve Jobs as having been the one who created Apple, and he was, but what people often don't realize about the story is that it actually started with Steve Wozniak, who was this very kind of shy and solitary guy who just loved computers, and he was working at Hewlett-Packard at the time, and he would sit there in his cubicle at Hewlett-Packard after everyone had gone home at night, and he would sit there and work on his prototype for this dream he had of a personal computer. And he finally, like in one solitary midnight, achieved this dream. And for him, that was the end of the story. He had achieved it. Eureka. But then he takes it to his friend Steve Jobs, and Steve Jobs is like, oh my gosh, this thing is huge, we have to start a company. And that's the energy that made Apple happen. So you really, this is just one example, there's so many others, but you really need both types in the mix. And I'm going to tell you a little bit later about my yin-yang relationship with my husband, who is an extrovert. Okay, I said we were going to talk about creativity. You might recognize this guy, who is Philippe Starck, who says that, well, let me back up before I tell you what Philippe Starck says. I want to tell you this, that psychologists have looked at who have been the most spectacularly creative people across art, business, science, and they almost always find people who are kind of a mix of introvert and extrovert. So they're extroverted enough that they can go out and exchange ideas, and they can advance their ideas once they have them. And they're introverted enough that they either crave solitude for its own sake, or they can at least tolerate it long enough to make their creative visions come alive. And this is where I come to Philippe Starck, because he says that he spends every year from May through September alone. And during this time, he says, he attends no parties, and he won't even so much as pick up a magazine, because he knows that if he wants to tap in to the creative impulses that are his and his alone, that he needs to be able to sequester himself from those around him. And this is an instinct that many artists have had for centuries. You know, people have talked about this for a long time. But we're living right now in a moment where people aren't really recognizing this, and there is instead a kind of, I don't know, it's a kind of glamorization of collaboration, which also for sure has its place. It's just that we're kind of in a lopsided mode right now of not also paying proper respect to the role of solitude in the creative process. And I will tell you, so now scientists are starting to kind of catch up with the instincts of the Philippe Starcks of the world, and they're starting to understand just why it is that solitude plays such an important role. And if you're curious about this, I have tons of research on it in my book, but I'm going to give you now just a few quick takeaways that you should know about. One of them, this came out of the Kellogg School recently, and it found that in your typical large meeting, you have 3 people doing 70% of the talking. So this alone is one of the reasons that you need people going off by themselves first, because otherwise you're tending to hear from the loudest voices. There is also, even for those of us, and I'm sure there are many of us in this room, even for those of us who tend to think of ourselves as original, iconoclastic even, types of thinkers, even for us, we tend, all of us as human beings, to be much more conformist than we think we are. And this is one of the reasons that if you want to be original, you've got to go off and have your solitude. And I'm going to just play for you now a really funny video of an early experiment that was done that shows the incredible tendency of human beings to conform. This is one of the most robust findings in social psychology, and I want to give you an idea of what it looks like. So I'm just going to play this video.
The Ash experiment is one of psychology's oldest and most popular pieces of research. A volunteer is told that he's taking part in a visual perception test. What he doesn't know is that the other participants are actors, and he's the only person taking part in the real test, which is actually about group conformity.
Please begin. The experiment you will be taking part in today involves the perception of line length. Your task will be simply to look at the line here on the left and indicate which of the 3 lines on the right is equal to it in length. So, for example, if you...
The actors have been told to match the wrong lines. The volunteer will be monitored to see if he gives the correct answer or if he goes along with the opinion of the group and gives the wrong answer. In the first test, the correct answer is 2.
1.
1.
1. 2.
1. Once again, the correct answer is 2.
3.
3.
3.
3.
3.
Yeah. So experiments like that, they've been repeated again and again, always with these kinds of results. And it's kind of horrifying. The guy who first created this experiment, he was a professor at Swarthmore, and he wondered for the rest of his life, when the subject says 3 instead of 2, do they know what the right answer is and they're just pretending to go along with the group? Or have they truly come to think that the wrong answer is the right answer? So let's just take a quick show of hands. How many of you think that they know what the right answer is and they're just pretending? Okay, that's a lot of you. And how many of you think that they've now truly come to think that the wrong answer is the right answer? Okay, we have a few brave people. And you brave people, you're probably correct. And I say this because we now have the ability to do experiments like these, but to stick the subject's head inside a brain scanner at the very moment that they're saying effectively 3 instead of 2. And we're getting a glimpse of what's going on in the mind when this happens. And so I'm going to take you briefly through one of these experiments so that you can see it. A brief disclaimer before we do. For the ladies in the audience, you might feel somewhat uncomfortable with the design of this experiment. And for the gentlemen in the audience, you are going to come across as somewhat dopey. But, you know, in the interest of science, we're going to move along. The way this worked was that the researchers took a group of male subjects, and they asked them to, they showed them photographs of female faces, which they asked them to rate for attractiveness on a scale of 1 to 7. And so you can see here one of the faces. You can't see the male subject, but that little box around the 4 shows us that he rated this woman a 4. And he's now about to move on to the next face, but before he does, he has a chance to see how a group of his male peers have rated the same woman, and they gave her a 6, if you can make out that little red box around the 6. So his peers think that this woman's much more attractive. And he takes this information in, and then he moves on through the rest of the faces. But about an hour later, he has a chance to rate this woman again. And just as would have been predicted by those earlier experiments in the video I showed you, he's now much more likely to give this woman a 6 than he was the first time around, with the only intervening factor being the opinion of his peers. But remember, his head is inside a brain scanner, and it turns out that in our brains, all of us have reward networks. And these are the dopamine-driven networks that become activated at the prospect of something exciting or appealing, such as an attractive stranger. And what we see is that this guy's reward networks are much more activated the second time they're seeing this woman than they were the first time, with, again, the only intervening factor being the opinion of his peers, which suggests that even about something as seemingly personal and visceral as who you're attracted to, even then, you and your colleagues are taking in other people's opinions, and you don't even know that you're doing it. Like, none of us are aware of this process taking place. And it doesn't matter how introverted or extroverted we are all of us very porous social beings. and we just take in the ideas and the opinions of those around us. It's often a good thing, but not necessarily when you're making a difficult decision, not necessarily when you're trying to be at your most creative. And if you doubt that this phenomenon is taking place, just consider that there would be no advertising industry if it weren't so. Okay, so what should we do about all of this? We could talk about this all day. How could we run meetings differently? How could we run classrooms differently? But I'm going to give you now just a couple tips to take away with you. 2 first for the introverts and 2 for the extroverts in the room. And ambiverts, you can use them all, I think. Okay, so for the introverts in the room, before you get into a meeting, I would advise you to think about what you want to say, what question do you want to ask, what do you want to contribute. Prepare that in advance. Maybe find an ally in advance of the meeting who you know has a similar outlook to yours, who might be backing you up. And then give yourselves a push to speak up early, which probably runs against your natural tendency. But the people who speak up early have ideas that tend to become the anchor ideas in the room. And even more importantly, on an emotional level, people start directing their energy to those who have spoken first. So their eye contact and their energy. So you're going to start to feel more in the center of things. Whereas if you wait longer to speak, the opposite thing happens and you start to kind of drift to the emotional margins. And it's not that you can't get back from there. You totally can. It's just a little bit harder. So just try that tweak and see what happens. Second, introverts. I hear this a lot from colleagues who work with introverts, that because as introverts we don't always show out the enthusiasm that we're actually feeling inside, your colleagues might not actually know that you care, and they need to know. And I told you that I was going to talk a little bit about my yin-yang relationship with my husband, who is an extrovert, and so I'm going to do that now. My husband has this really lovely way of celebrating when great things happen. And when I first met him, it was right after I had stopped being a Wall Street lawyer and I had decided I wanted to become a writer. And all I really had to show for myself at that point were a few poems. I had decided that I was going to write a memoir in sonnet form, because why not? And so I had these sonnets, and we had been on a few dates at that point, and he had been a UN peacekeeper, and he was about to publish this internationally best-selling memoir of his experiences as a peacekeeper, and I very nervously handed him my poems for him to read. And later on that evening, I got this email, which I'm going to share with you. This is what he said. And he's been that way always. So, it was some years later that I published Quiet, and believe me, when it first came out, I was excited. He was like, he was jumping up and down, he was ululating, he was all excited to plan a party. And I was just as excited, but my version of expressing that was much more like, this is great. It's much more muted. And that's totally okay when it's my thing that we're celebrating. But what I always have to remember is that when it's his thing that we're celebrating, I have to take an extra step to show it more outwardly so that he knows that I care. And he, of course, also has to remember that I'm never going to express it his way, and that's okay too. And this is just one example of why I started off by saying that so much depends on introverts and extroverts understanding each other, because first of all, you can avert an entire universe of misunderstandings, and then all the great stuff is free to bubble up from there. Okay, now extroverts, you on the other hand, you can stand to curb your enthusiasm just a little bit, and I'll give you here the example of Sheryl Sandberg, the COO of Facebook, who describes herself as extremely extroverted, and who hired a coach to help her to speak up less in meetings. kind of the opposite of why many people hire their coaches. But she realized that she's so kind of irrepressible that she was dominating meetings, and she really sincerely wanted to hear from other people, and it wasn't happening as much as she liked. And so she made this tweak for herself. Extroverts, you should also know, in general, you're not going to get the best of an introvert's brain in an all-hands, quick-paced meetings. And introverts will often say that by the time they thought of the thing that they wanted to say, the meeting was over. So do it another way. Schedule a one-on-one. Let them know what it is you want to talk about so that they have time to think and process before the discussion happens. Okay, leadership, I told you we were going to think about. How many of you have heard of the book Good to Great? Okay, a few of you. This was a book that was about a landmark study of the top 11 best performing companies in the country. And Jim Collins, who did this study, wanted to figure out what set these companies apart from their more mediocre peers. He found that every single one of these companies, these high flyers, every single one was led by a CEO who was described as having two characteristics. The first one was a fierce sense of will and dedication to the company. The second one was these CEOs were, all 11 of them, described as quiet, unassuming, soft-spoken, and shy. So that is a constellation of adjectives, which I think, if we're being honest with ourselves, we do not associate with a so-called natural leader. And those findings seem mystifying on their face. I'll tell you, if you've been immersed in this stuff as long as I have, they're somewhat less mystifying, because here is a truth. Introverts tend to like to go really deep into one or two or three subjects that they're really jazzed about. And if the thing that they're jazzed about is a project at work or the company or what have you, they're really going to do it. And so in the service of those passions, they will acquire all kinds of expertise, they will build networks. What ends up happening is that they ascend to leadership positions not through starting with a desire to become a leader, but rather just through getting there through this alternative channel. So these are very often not the kinds of leaders who, when they were school children, effortlessly organized their playmates on the playground to play some new game. They were not those kids at all. So in those ways, they're not natural leaders, you could say. But there are there's vast other universe of role models of what leadership can look like, and we are, all of us, limiting ourselves by thinking that leadership only comes in the kind of type A, hyper-charismatic variety. So I want to just give you quickly a couple of examples of these other types of leaders, but really with the idea towards getting you to think about who the leaders are in your lives who are like this. So this one, some of you may know her. This is Beth Comstock. She was, until recently, the vice chair of GE. She's widely credited with bringing GE kind of, culturally into the new age. All those cool commercials that you see are because of Beth's thinking. And she describes herself as an introvert who's constantly stepping outside her comfort zone, but also drawing on her own natural strength of going deep, being super curious and figuring out what's around the next corner. And then this over here is Douglas Conant, who until recently was the CEO of Campbell Soup, which when he first took it over was at the bottom of the Fortune 500 in employee engagement ratings. And when he stepped down 10 years later, it was all the way at the top. And Doug is a really shy guy, and he's quite introverted. And so he's not the guy who is effortlessly out there backslapping with his staff. But he did it another way. He's really sincere. And he would figure out who were the employees who were really contributing, and he would sit down and write to them personal letters of thanks. And during his time at Campbell, he wrote 30,000 of these letters. 30,000. Yeah, it's a crazy number. And an extroverted CEO would find a different and equally great way of connecting with employees. But the point I want you to take away is that there are a lot of different ways. And we tend to be told, there's one model of what a creative person looks like. There's one model of a leader. There's one model of the salesperson. And that's just not true. It's more a question of taking these roles and the ones that we're passionate about and then suiting them, building them to suit to our own temperaments. Okay, so what do we do with all this stuff? I'm going to leave you now with 5 different ideas. The first one is, and I keep on touching on this, it's the importance of staying in your comfort zone when you need it to get the work done and just to feel really good, and stepping outside your comfort zone strategically. So you should be asking yourselves always, do I need to be outside my comfort zone here? And do it only for the sake of the projects that really, really matter to you, for the work that matters to you, for the people that you love. That's the time to do it. And I'm going to share with you my own, kind of on a big scale, version of stepping outside my comfort zone of a time that it really mattered. And this for me is that I used to be absolutely flat out terrified of public speaking. And during all those years that I was a Wall Street lawyer, I would just grit my teeth through it and manage it somehow. But then I started writing, and I was writing quiet, and my book was coming out, and I really, really cared about it. And I didn't want my fear of public speaking to stand in my way. And so I decided that was the time I was going to really figure it out. And so I embarked then on what I called my year of speaking dangerously, which is I found out from the psychological research that the way to conquer any fear, and it could be the fear of speaking, but you guys might have other fears out there too. Any fear is that you need to expose yourself to the thing that you fear in very small and manageable steps. So you don't start by giving a TED Talk. I signed up for a seminar for people with the fear of public speaking. And the way the seminar worked, on the first day, you showed up, all you had to do was stand up, say your name, sit back down, declare victory, and you're finished. And then you'd come back the next week, and you'd stand up, and the leader would have people in the audience ask you a few simple questions, like where did you go to school, and where did you grow up? And you'd answer those, sit back down, you're done. And you keep on ratcheting it up, little by little by little by little, until it's almost a kind of miracle that I would not have thought possible. A fear really can either melt away completely or to the point where it ceases to be a problem. So that's just one version of stepping outside your comfort zone. Do it when it matters. Okay, third, for those of you who are or who know in your teams, introverts who are well-respected, who are influential, please encourage them to start speaking about this in an open way. This again is Douglas Conant, the Campbell Soup CEO who I told you about, who started blogging at Harvard Business Review about his temperament and opening up about it at his company. And he says there's not anything he did in all his time as a leader that had the impact as when he started doing that, because it was sending everybody the message that the right thing to do is to show up as your full selves. And there's almost nothing more powerful than a role model that everybody can look up to understand what the strengths are of a given way of being and what the challenges are that we all can overcome. Okay, fourth, I talked about leadership a little bit earlier. I would like to ask each of you, just quietly in your seats, to think about someone you know, and it might be you, and it might be someone else you know. Someone who is super, super talented and who is not a so-called natural leader. And what could you do to be grooming that person to share all the talents that they have with the people around them? I mean, could you find out what their true ambitions are for 1 year from now, 3 years from now, 5 years from now? And sit down with them and map out a plan of how they're going to get there. And what are the strategic steps they're going to take outside their comfort zone? And what are the ways that they're going to draw on the strengths that they already have? People often assume that the quiet ones are not ambitious, and there's no correlation between temperament and ambition. So what could you do on that? Next, one of the best things you can do in your teams is get people talking about this in a kind of everyday, no big deal way. And a really easy conversation starter is on my website. I've got this website, Quiet Revolution, so it's quietrev.com. There's tons of resources on there, including a personality test that you can take for free. It's really easy and quick. And you can just give this out to your teams and use it as a conversation starter to get your teams talking just openly about what does each person need, how do you all work differently, and how could you accommodate each other better. Okay, and then finally, I am going to end exactly where I began. And that is with that suitcase full of books that I took with me to summer camp all those years ago, and that I still carry with me everywhere I go. I've got it right now. It's funny, I was mentioning my suitcase full of books a few weeks ago when I was speaking at Amazon, and when I was done speaking, this crowd of engineers all came running up to speak to me, and I was really curious about what they wanted to ask. And their question was, why are you not using a Kindle? But I still like old-fashioned books. Okay, anyway, for me, it's my suitcase full of books. I've still got it. But I want to ask each of you to think about what is in your suitcases, whether literally or metaphorically. Like, what is the thing that matters so much to you that you carry it with you everywhere you go? And for the extroverts in the room, it's probably quite natural for you to, once you've identified those things, to take them out and share them with the people around you. And for the introverts in the room, it's probably more natural for you to guard those things kind of carefully and maybe not share them so much. And that's cool too, but I just want to ask you every so often to take those things out of your suitcase and share them. Because the world needs you, and it needs the things you carry. And so in closing, I want to say to all of you, to wish to all of you, may you have the best of all possible journeys, and may you have the courage to speak softly. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Susan. That was incredible, an incredible way to start our day. I just want to encourage you guys to be back here at 2 p.m. for Jessica Tillier Spark, then 2:15 for our keynote. Right now, if you want to head off to your breakout sessions, thank you, and have a wonderful morning. We'll see you this afternoon.
And I know she'll be the death of me, at least we'll both be numb. And she'll always get the best of me, the worst is yet to come. But at least we'll both be beautiful and stay forever young. This I know.